Yes, sir.
Well, been in the history ever since I was a little kid in the 50s. And when you read Alamo books in the late 50s, the numbers,
We're trying to hear you, we can't hear you.
well, you should shut up, you might be able to hear
If
me.
My mother doesn't tell me to shut up, so don't you.
Started with, point being, that when the very first book I read, I remember there was like 15,000, the number was 15,000 of the Mexican army. And I wrote an article not too long ago that the last figure I saw, they were saying there was like only 2,400 Mexican in the Mexican army. So this watering down, trying to water down a thing, it's been going on for a long time. It's reaching a crescendo now, but it's been going around a long time.
And they want to look, I mean, I understand revision through historical scholarship, right? I mean, that happens all the time. When you're wanting to report numbers, if there's scholarship that proves and research that proves this certain thing, then beyond a shadow of doubt, let's tell the story as it's supposed to be told. But I share the concern with them trying to downplay the battle, because by the time it's all over with, it'll be 180 guys bullied, 6 farmers and a blind dog. I mean, that's what it'll turn out to be if we leave it up to those guys.
Yeah, political winds change, and I question, why does the legislature think the ownership and management should be under the legislature? Anything can happen here in the next 20 years, right?
Right.
And the legislature might wind up being more agreeable to this international management thing. So to me, the daughters of the Republic of Texas seem to be the ones who really have an expressed interest in the Alamo.
Yeah, and look, I don't disagree with that. What I was laying out was specifically kind of the situation as it is right now, and where it's easiest for us to go. A good example of that is if one of these legislators went in and filed a bill right now and said we need to remove the Alamo completely from under the authority of the state and place it directly under the authority of the Daughters of the Republic of Texas, you're not going to see that go anywhere. And there's a lot of reason for that, is once the state has got its hands on it, they're not going to want to let it go. So for me, and just sort of my perspective on the issue, our legislative priorities, our proposed legislation, I've actually got a copy of it here, actually would place it under Texas Parks and Wildlife, where it would be managed like the San Jacinto Monument and Washington on the Brazos. You go look at all these other Texas Revolution sites. They're under the authority of Texas Parks and Wildlife, but are administered and managed by nonprofits. Matter of fact, the nonprofit that manages the Washington on the Brazos and the Star of Texas Museum there is one of the longest running historical nonprofits in Texas. And I think Dan Patrick's wife is actually on the board of directors over there. It's one of those prestigious things. So,
Well, I've been to both of those, and does what I see represent what really happened?
as far as which part?
Historically.
Washington on the Brazos and San Jacinto.
Well, Washington on the Brazos was virtually a farm. I mean, it was
Right.
it was basically. I mean, it was a town,
Has
right?
the
Right.
narrative been
Has the
altered?
narrative changed? Well, and I'm going to tell you, that's a big concern for us. One of the things, and while I'm here talking about the Alamo, I might as well bring this up. We've got an issue not just with how the Alamo's being handled, but we've got somewhat of an issue with how San Jacinto's being handled. You want to talk about changing the narrative?
That's my question.
Yeah, you want to talk about changing the narrative. It really is up to us, people like us, sounding the alarm when these things happen. Because, I mean, if you think about it, people read placards at these places, but that's because, as a society, we don't revere these sites, perhaps like previous generations did. So you wind up in a situation like, I shared what some of the things they've said about the Alamo. If you go to the San Jacinto Monument now, and you read the placards there, I'm not sure if you guys are aware of this or not, but that was a great American victory that secured America's manifest destiny. That's the story they're telling there. It's like, wait a minute, that was not an American battle, that was the Texan army that fought that, and that secured our independence. You know, your manifest destiny apparently came later when, you know, we were sold to the United States after the Mexican-American War. But that's, those changes in the narrative are so subtle. And so when people like us who know better see them, we have to remember that thousands of people traipse through there every day. And that may be all that they ever learn about what happened. And then they go off with these misconceptions. This is how entire societies are changed, when tweaks are made to how their culture is passed to their citizenry. So it's a huge, the culture, and let me tell you, from an organizational perspective, we hold equal weight in our mission to the political, the cultural, and the economic. You hear a lot about the political, but the cultural is important. And let me, and I know I explained earlier, but let me just drive this point home. When we teach new members about our organization, and especially independence, we establish independence here, and we show political, cultural, and economic as 3 pillars, okay? And each of those 3 pillars hold up independence, and if one is weaker than the other, the whole thing topples. When I'm looking at the cultural aspect of this, San Jacinto is part of that pillar. Washington on the Brazos is part of that pillar. Things that happened after the Texas Revolution are part of that pillar. When people first settled here, Stephen F. Austin, those are part of the pillar. But it's our belief that when it comes to the Alamo, the very base of that is the very base of that pillar. Because if that gets crumbled, the rest of the lessons that are taught by all of that history and all that culture are forever damaged. And that's why this is a battle that we cannot lose. Yes,
Why,
ma'am.
I mean, I'm from Texas now, and I've lived here 38 years, but
Naturalized?
why did people just let it go? I mean, it's like, where are these brains? I mean, did Perry stand for this? The governor? Former governor?
Yeah, I don't know where Perry was on this, because I'm going to be honest with you, it really didn't come up a lot. You know, I mean, when
Snuck it on the bottom.
they
It's
snuck it in.
insidious.
You know, I talked to some of the legislators who voted on that initial 2011 legislation. First and foremost, they don't remember it. I have to show it to them. I have to show them the bill. Then I have to show them in the journal that they voted for it, and then they can't remember why they voted for it. You know, I'm like, wait a minute. You're supposed to be the most, you know, one of the most conservative, staunch Republicans in your particular, you know, house of the Texas legislature, and yet you voted for a bill that was introduced by a Democrat, sponsored in the other house by a Democrat, and literally had no other co-sponsors, no other co-authors from your party, and you blindly pulled the lever for it.
Did
I mean,
Steve Top vote for it back under 11?
I don't know that Steve voted for it. You know, I'm not going to get into my individual conversations with some of these legislators, but Steve's a good guy. You know, Steve's working with us on this, and look, I'm proud to call Steve a friend. We don't agree on everything, but I mean, all of us here in the room don't agree on everything. But Steve, when it comes to these really serious pro-Texas issues like this, Steve is as strong as they come. So, you know, I know they're going to be champions for this, but look, you know, we're sitting here in House 21. I mean, we gotta work Dave. I mean, I'm telling everybody everywhere I go, you pick your rep, you pick your senator, and then pick the reps and senators all around you, and you let them know that you want this thing taken care of. You want the Alamo preserved, and not by the General Land Office. You don't want it reimagined.
First of all, thank you for the presentation. I've been to a lot of conferences and things, and people give little short overviews. This is the best in depth. I wish you could give this like the TPPF's legislative policy orientation. That'd be awesome.
Aren't you the new president?
Yeah. No, yeah. So, but I actually worked for Bob Hall as his bill writer for a couple of years, so kind of neat to hear that. But my question is, what is your thoughts on this resolution, not resolution, I guess it's putting it to the vote,
SJR2.
SJR2 versus reversing the legislation? You know, what's the pros, cons versus going to the voters on it versus the legislature taking it back and going with Parks and Wildlife or what have you?
Yeah, I'll tell you, if I'm weighing them out, you know, looking at SJR2, let me just start there because that's where you started. SGR2 is kind of interesting because it does a couple of things. Number one is it deals in its language specifically with the narrative. Okay, so, you know, if you're looking at it from our standpoint, we got our battleground restored, we got our museum, we got our restoration of its hallowed nature. Now, the big concern about the narrative, okay? And I share your concerns about the political winds changing, which is why, well, that's a whole other, but I share the concern, but let me tell you what their thought process is, and this is from not just Bob, it's from a lot of them, is that, you know, right now, we have it vested in the authority of the General Land Office, and you know how hard it is for these incumbents to get bounced. If we have a significant problem with the direction of the Alamo, they believe that having it vested in government that's a little closer to us, say a panel of state reps and state senators, will go a whole lot, we'll have a lot, it'll be a lot easier to affect change in that regard than if we vested in some state level official, okay? So I like it for the reason that it specifically addresses the narrative, and I'm kind of anxious to see what the enabling legislation would look like. As I said, our viewpoint has been to place it under Texas Parks and Wildlife. That also has some of its own issues. First and foremost, Texas Parks and Wildlife, from a governmental structural standpoint, makes the most sense because that's where all the other stuff is. You know, all the other historic. So from an efficiency standpoint, that makes the most sense. However, the concern there is that a lot of times in dealing with these historical sites, there's concern that I think one legislature referred to the panels that they put in charge of these as a bunch of Birkenstock wearing, peace bead, patchouli smelling intellectuals. I think I got that right. So there is that concern. Either way we go, there are, you know, either way we go, it's sort of an all hands on deck approach. We have to come out guns blazing. The first thing we have to do is we have to get it out from under the GLO, where it has no sense being. We know George P. Bush is not doing the right thing. We also know that we have to get the original battleground, footprint of the battleground, out of the hands of the city of San Antonio. As it stands right now, that part that's owned by the city of San Antonio has been signed over to the state of Texas on a 50-year lease for this project. But all of that can be cured by letting the state eminent domain one of its own political subdivisions and just taking the whole thing, which there's been some discussion about that. So getting the city of San Antonio out of the equation. I think once you do that, once you get the GLO out of the picture, get the city of San Antonio out of the equation, then while some of those others may have some of their issues, they are all much better, both in the short term and the long term, for us to be able to do something concrete about preserving the Alamo. Okay. Oh, we got one over here. Yes, sir.
How did it go to the land office when that made no sense in looking at everything else? What was the reason for that?
I can't find anyone who can tell me the rationale. That's actually, it was the point I was getting at a moment ago when I talked to these legislators and say, what was the deal about passing this? You know, because you have to remember, the attempt to shove out the DRT, you know, since the 90s, had repeatedly tried to put it under Texas Parks and Wildlife, sort of to disguise shoving out the DRT.
Oh.
Okay, so
they tried to take it to Parks and Wildlife.
They tried to take it to Parks and Wildlife, but if you look at the original legislation that was filed, the bill that kind of kicked it off in 2011, the one that eventually passed, it firmly stuck it in the GLO. So we've been making the rounds, talking to these legislators, the guys on the committee. Now the ones we haven't talked to were the Democrat who filed it and the Democrat who co-sponsored or who sponsored it. But we can't find anyone who can tell us what the rationale was. No one either seems to know or want to admit what the rationale was behind it. So
It doesn't make sense, but we did it.
that's it. And so, you know, once it's done, it's done. Even more than that, one of the things that they did was, as part of that legislation, I'll share this real quick. That legislation called for the establishment of a preservation board, okay? And it was going to be an appointee from the governor's office, one from the lieutenant governor, one from the speaker of the house, and then, you know, representatives of the DRT. You know, it's supposed to be this board, somebody from the city of San Antonio. Well, that board never met. Like, they never actually formed it because it was not a, you know, you shall, it was a you may to the general land office, so they never formed it. So in 2015, they go back And Bush wants to get revisions to the legislation because at this point, he's edged the DRT out of the picture, and the city of San Antonio is playing a much larger role in this. So he goes back, and as part of the legislation that he asked for, you get the board, as it's specified out, that has a completely different composition, including a much heavier influence on the San Antonio entertainment and tourism industry. And that one passed, if you can believe that. It was the one that, it allowed all kinds of things to happen, but that was the one that, and to date, that board has never formed. Instead, what he did was he established this additional nonprofit organization that has no transparency. So, this is the kind of shell game nonsense that we're having to deal with on a regular basis. And let me just say this, these guys get by with this because while, like I said at the very beginning, while we may say remember the Alamo, we don't really pay attention to the Alamo, right? That's why the city of San Antonio has been allowed to use it as their playground for the longest time. There was a Tea Party leader, and I'm sure Jeff will post this on the internet later, so if it's still recording, so I'll go ahead and call you out, but not by name. But there was a Tea Party leader up in North Texas who was approached about the dangers about the Alamo, not even by us, but by one of the people from one of the other organizations, and said, well, we're too busy with what's going on up here right now. That's a San Antonio problem. Okay, so this is the kind of stuff that we're dealing with. The Alamo is not a San Antonio memorial.
It's like a football game.
Those people didn't die for the independence of San Antonio.
No.
Those people died for the independence. So this is a Texas thing. And it goes back to that societal issue that we have, that it's incumbent upon us who want to preserve that culture to pass that along and to revere it as our ancestors revered it. Probably better than the city of San Antonio did. But to channel that spirit of Adina Days Zavala and Clara Driscoll. Yes, sir.
They've already accomplished this about the war between the states. No, they have totally eliminated the Southern culture, the facts and figures regarding the war between states and what have you, getting it to a point to where people are intimidated from flying the Confederate flag. This continues, someday people will be intimidated to not fly the Texas flag.
I believe that there is a window of opportunity. And I talk, every time I talk about Texas independence, and especially Texas, I have to bring this up, but I think in light of your comments, I think it's very appropriate for right now, and then I'll knock off, because I don't want to bore you guys to tears, but let me just say this. I always say this, is that we have a finite window of opportunity. I mean, this war for the independence of Texas is an all or nothing proposition. If we don't, we're at this crossroads right now, where if Texas, and Texans especially, do not embrace that principle in Article 1, Section 1, through Article 1, Section 2, where if we don't embrace Texas being a free and independent state, and saying that we are best to govern ourselves, not bureaucrats in Washington, D.C., if we don't embrace that, then what we're going to look at is systematically
Right.
our continued ignoring of that is going to lead us to losing it all. Texas won't be Texas. I mean, I'm going to give you a weird one. You hear right now, after the 2016 general election, you hear the drumbeat of eliminating the Electoral College.
Yeah.
That's right.
Those people are raising holy hell, saying, why do we even have it? It's antiquated. Not realizing that the United States is a union of states.
But what they're doing is we got a briefing on that. Gwen may be able to tell you more than I can, but they're doing it at the state legislative level, and they've already accomplished where states totaling 171 electoral votes have already passed it in their legislature not to abide by it sometime in the future. And all they need is 100 more states with 100 more electoral votes to agree to that. And we have lost the Electoral College. And the lady that briefed us on it was Tony Andy Shield. That's who it was at the Greater Houston Republican Women. If we lose the Electoral College, she had all sorts of facts and figures that basically New York State and California will be running the country.
Well, and we know that to be the case. But my point here specifically is the fact that the people, by and large, that are in the streets advocating for it, not the head honchos, the ring, but the people in the streets, the average rank and file that say, hey, we need to get rid of the Electoral College. Don't understand that the
Exactly.
Electoral
Right.
College
They're
speaks to the
idiots.
fundamental construction of the union. So, but back to your point, when I say that we have a finite window, we do. It's an all or nothing proposition, and it's why we have to fight this front. You know, not just the political, not just the economic, but the cultural being so vastly important. I've seen time and time again in that spring of nations from 1945 to the end of the 20th century, when we went from 54 recognized countries around the world to 192. I have seen time and time again how that's played out if people forget that they have to have all three. It's nothing to claim that you're free and independent and that you have the capability and the right of self-government if you refuse to exercise it. Whether that means we govern ourselves as an independent nation or whether we preserve a monument that speaks directly to what the spirit of Texas really is. Yes, sir, the last one.
Well,
and then I'll-
you mentioned one money amount in there, but I wonder, is funding one of the issues that's being tossed around?
In what regard?
Any improvement and maintenance of the Alamo?
Yeah, that was actually, that 75 million was in addition. The total budgetary items specifically earmarked for the
I
Alamo.
mean, for the argument today, that's all passed now, right? For the argument today, where should it be, who should own it, who should take care of it, is funding one of the issues?
Are you, if you're asking, do you think we need to hammer the funding issue? I will tell you that there is a specific line of attack that's going to happen in the legislature that I don't necessarily agree with. There's a state rep who's wanting to file a bill to basically pull all the funding from the Alamo unless they back off the Reimagine the Alamo project. That thing's dead on arrival, and all he's doing is making, basically making ammunition for whoever's going to primary him in the next election. But I think that there is a case to be made for getting it out from under the general land office and either placing it under direct control of the legislative board or under Texas Parks and Wildlife. That's why I mentioned a moment ago, one of the reasons that we proposed Texas Parks and Wildlife as part of our legislative priorities was that we could make the efficiency argument. Texas Parks and Wildlife already has the experience to do this. They already have the infrastructure to do it. They already have the historians on staff. Why are we creating an entirely new bureaucracy under an agency who has never done this before, who doesn't know how to do it, and shouldn't be doing it under their mandated constitutional responsibility? So there is a governmental efficiency and a financial argument that can be made. It's wasting a lot of money. The one thing I will say that has come out of this whole mess is the legislature has been willing to give up more money for finance, operation, and maintenance of the Alamo. It's not a lot, but they have been willing to give up some additional money. So when that 75 million came out from the rainy day fund, that was specifically earmarked for this Alamo master plan that, again, did not exist in its final form at the time. But the total budgetary amount was like 87.5, I think, was the total figure, 87.5 million, somewhere, 87.5.
Is it self-supporting?
Yeah, I think perhaps at this point it is. But I think you have to get into, again, these questions are not black and white, because you have to get into what is self-supporting. There's a lot of maintenance and preservation work
I can imagine.
that have to go on at the Alamo. So, in addition to running it, they don't charge you to get in, right? So they have to have that revenue coming in, and typically they have this particular nonprofit that was originally established. Each member of the board, I believe, has to raise $250,000 a year, and that goes to that. However, one of the things that they have been doing extensively over the past few years is they've been doing additional archaeological digs to try to find additional artifacts that are on the site to identify what they know there are graves there. Like if you look at the map during the mission era, over to, I believe, if you're facing the church over to the right, was actually a cemetery. So, there's some issues there, and that costs additional money beyond just, lights, water, and gas. They've got some things that need to be done to the site. So are they self-sufficient? Probably. Do they need more funding? Yes.
Yeah.
Is that post office part of the battlefield? They've got a big old post office there. I always heard it was part of the battlefield.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, that was, you know, they've already started, and I didn't mention this, but they've already started, one of the first things we got checked off of our list of demands was the restoration to the original footprint. The state bought all of that property across the street. So where you see that Ripley's Believe It or Not and all that kitschy tourist trap stuff, those buildings are all owned by the state of Texas right now, and they're basically waiting on leases to expire. But all of those will either be removed or converted into use for the Alamo facility. But that was one of the, you know, and oddly enough, that's one of the most heinous, they tried to do the post office, but the federal government wouldn't budge on it, which is a whole other topic for another time. But one of the things that has drawn, I think, some ire is that they want to take one of those buildings and put a rooftop restaurant so you can dine overlooking the Alamo. It's like, wait a minute, you guys missed the memo here. This is about restoring it to the original footprint and treating it with respect. I mean, you know, they're not. Are they going to put a Burger King at Gettysburg? I mean, is that what's going to happen?
Eventually.
You know, they're going to open one of those underwater dining restaurants at Pearl Harbor. I mean, that's the kind of mindset these guys have. So that's why we have to be very vigilant with these things. Yes, ma'am.
I want you to go over one more time what the name of Senator Hall's bill is.
SJR2.
And if we call our legislatures, then we're supposed to say, support this bill?
Yeah, we want SJR2. What I would recommend is, like I said, go to our website, tnm.me, click on the Defend the Alamo link, and what we do is we have you put in your address and it'll spit out a report. You basically will get an email with links to download all kind of information, including sample legislation and everything else. But the other thing that it does is it allows us to, as we get this information in, to disseminate it out. I'll tell you, like I told Bob on the phone today, is we're ready to mobilize every single supporter in our organization, every supporter, every member. As hard as we've come at these guys over having a referendum on this issue, they're going to get it twice as hard over the Alamo, and that ain't no lie. That's a promise.
How do we join your organization? Do you
Well,
have-
we haven't had it until now. Texas has been asleep at the wheel on this. There's just not been the outrise that should have been taking place. I mean, we saw it during the primaries,
Yep.
they let George P. Bush get in there, and if you look at the election returns, he was right up there with Greg Abbott in there, 54%, I believe.
It was
So
high.
there was not an outcry. There hasn't been an outcry. Even the DRT is not fighting.
Well, and look, it's up to us. I mean, that's the bottom line. I will tell you, as I said earlier, when I was detailing kind of the early history of our fight over this thing, there was a period of time, every meeting, probably up until 2 years ago, we were the only people there fighting, you know, raising
Well, I believe you.
holy hell about this stuff. I mean, we were the only ones.
Why are
And,
the Texas not doing it though? Why? They're
Uh,
just sitting back.
I
Ignorance.
just don't think people understand
They
it. They
don't.
just don't
I mean,
get it.
think about
You
it. I mean,
didn't know all the backstory when you came in tonight.
You know, a lot of
I knew
people,
some
Right.
things, and I just couldn't get anybody else to listen to me.
well,
I'm
here's
sorry.
the bottom line. You heard how long it took me tonight. I can't translate that into a meme with a picture of a kitten.
Right.
So that becomes a problem because it is a complex issue. And so, you know, look, we're going to have to go out there and you know, look, we know our neighbors, we know our friends, we know our circles. We're going to have to get really comfortable with having this conversation with these guys. And then if they won't advocate, we're going to have to be their voice, and we're going to have to do it just as loud as if they were there with us. And that's the bottom line. I mean, this has to be the Alamo issue. And I'll tell you, just like I tell everybody, you know, like I tell our supporters and members about the referendum, this has got to be the make or break issue for you. I mean, this has got to be it. This has got to be one of those issues that you can look a politician squarely in the eye and go, look, I love you. You know, I'll break bread with you. I'll go take you for a cup of coffee. But I'm going to tell you right now, if you don't do something about this, you and I are not going to be friends anymore. You know, you know, if someone, if they ran the six farmers and the blind dog against you, that's who's getting my vote. I mean, and they gotta know that you're serious.
But they
See
don't
that?
know it because what I just said, George P. was able to pull 54% of the vote with this going on.
Right, you
So
heard the
we
convention
didn't
too.
make our voices heard.
Well, look,